I guess what I'm going to do is talk about the Renaissance, the way in which the term is shifted or is shifting, my take on it, I guess the work that I've been doing over the last 20 odd years, but also dipping in and out to give you a sense, I guess, of where the field is and what people are working on at that kind of research level, I guess, through sort of university stuff. So the first thing that I always talk about when I'm teaching Renaissance is, that the term itself is an absolute chimera. So it's a 19th century term. It's invented by male European historians. Nobody uses the term in the 15th and 16th century. So nobody walked around thinking they're in the Renaissance. In a way, I guess that's true of most of those big conceptual period chronological notions, the medieval, Enlightenment, and so on. But I think there's something very significant about how it works in terms of defining and inventing this idea of Renaissance, because of how the 19th century, and especially European intellectuals and thinkers, absolutely occlude the global dimension and make it very specifically a white, predominantly male, predominantly Southern European manifestation. And I think that that's wrong. I think we've still got a huge problem in terms of getting beyond or outside of what you might call a kind of, I guess, a Victorian imperial notion of the Renaissance. The term itself is first invented by a French historian, Jules Michelet. He writes this big multi-volume history of France. In 1855, one of the volumes is called La Renaissance, the Renaissance. He invents the term, and he applies it very interestingly, surprise, surprise, to France in the 16th century. So we talk more about how this sort of idea develops. Then it's subsequent to Michelet, the Swiss-German thinker Jacob Burckhardt does this kind of very influential book called The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, and that's 1860. So it's Burckhardt who uses the term Renaissance, but unlike Michelet, uses it to talk about the Italian peninsula. It's predominantly late 14th and early 15th century. And Burckhardt's text still, haunts, I think, everything that people do when they talk about Renaissance. Because the Victorians, and Walter Pater gets in on the act in 1873, he writes his book, The Renaissance. And for Pater, it's much more not a chronological period, because of course he's coming out of the aesthetic movement, and he's talking very much about this idea of the spirit, the aesthetic spirit of the Renaissance. So he shifts the terms again. So from Michelet, talking about print culture, talking about France in the 16th century, Burckhardt takes it back to the 15th century, talks about Italy. Pater then starts to talk about this idea of the aesthetics, and it's a lot about Leonardo and the spirit of the Renaissance, so not really a periodization. So as I was saying, I think the problem with this is that it gives you a very, very narrow notion of what the Renaissance is. As I said, it's exclusively white, it's male, it's elite, it's primarily cultural, it's art and literature. But it's very much shaped by 19th century attitudes towards the wider world. And of course, as you can guess from what I've been saying, it's driven very much by ideologies of European empire and colonization. So as a result, at the point where Europe is scrambling to colonize Africa, none of these thinkers who talk about the Renaissance have any space for African or Asian influences or exchange at all. It's just not there. The Ottomans, which I'm going to talk about a bit because the Ottomans are such a key player for me in terms of how you think about the Renaissance. The Ottomans and the Turkish Ottoman Empire, of course, in this period when people like Burckhardt and Pater are writing, Turkey is seen as famously the sick man of Europe, is seen as oppressive, backward. So again, absolute inclusion of the Ottomans, such a key player in this period, 15th, 16th century Europe, completely knocked out. Nobody talks about them in this period. It's really only been in the last 30 years, probably even less, that started to change. Another issue, I think, for us, Shannon and I were just talking a little bit about how you then think about the Renaissance in terms of England, Tudor England. Tudor England is absolutely not part of this story. I get really concerned when people talk about the English Renaissance. I don't think England had a Renaissance. It's a very controversial thing. We can talk about that. But they're absolutely on the periphery. People like Michelet and Burckhardt are not talking about England. It is not part of this narrative. I might come back to that. I think one of the issues, though, of course, is that we all think that history is to some extent a history of the present. It's driven by our present preoccupations and imperatives. And I think that we always need to address that. And I guess I'll say I'm doing something similar when I talk about a certain view of the global Renaissance. It's no surprise that term's being used when we are so currently embedded in the language about globalization, contemporary globalization. So I think the 19th century was very much writing the history of the present when it invented the whole notion of what the Renaissance was. And I think we, of course, still try and remain very vigilant to that sense of imposing our own values on material from 500 years ago. So we have that problem. I think the other problem is where is the Renaissance? Where does it happen? So we've got a problem of chronology. We've got a problem also of geography. We classically talk about the Italian Renaissance in the Italian peninsula, all these problems. There is no such thing as Italy, of course, in this period. It's not a unified nation state until the late 19th century. So we're talking about the Italian peninsula, a group of rival city-states. Is that where we locate it? Traditionally, yes, that's what Burckhardt does. But what about Northern Europe? What about Dürer? What about Erasmus? What about so many other thinkers and writers and artists from Northern Europe? Art historians tend to now speak of a southern as opposed to a northern Renaissance, and a lot of stuff about what crosses the Alps and what doesn't, both ways. So if we have a Northern European Renaissance, how different is it from the Southern European Renaissance? And even if we're using the term at all, how meaningful is it? So art historians will talk about the Quattrocento, they'll talk about the 1400s. Their focus when they speak about the Renaissance is 15th century. Historians of the book talk about the emergence of print, the invention of print from the sort of late 15th century. So they're focusing their notion of Renaissance being primarily driven by print culture from late 15th to 16th century. If you're studying religious history, you're going to focus on the Reformation, and you're going to think of the catastrophic impact of the Lutheran Reformation and how that sort of runs throughout the 16th century. So religious historians will almost say that really the Renaissance, as they understand it, comes to an end with Luther, Calvin, and that conflict with Catholic's endless internecine war throughout this period. Literary critics, of one of which I should say I was trained, I'm very interdisciplinary, so I went to Sussex University in the 80s. So people call me a historian, but I actually cross history and literature. But mainly I actually teach literature, although I publish in, I guess, what people would call history. So as a result, I have a real problem with my dear literary colleagues who I think make terrible mistakes because they insist that you want to have Shakespeare in the mix because of the canonicity of Shakespeare. So if you're teaching English Renaissance literature, which I think is an utterly meaningless term, you're really starting from about 1580 and going to about 1640 and the Civil Wars. I just don't buy that at all. I think that the impact of classical learning, Greco-Roman classical learning, is so limited on mid-16th century Tudor England that we can't talk about the English Renaissance, and certainly not English Renaissance literature. I always try and avoid using those terms when I'm doing curriculum stuff. But of course, it's an easy way, it's a sort of catch-all term that people find easy to use. So in a way, chronologically and geographically, I think the whole concept of a notion of a singular Renaissance ends up, it just dissolves. As soon as you start to do any closer work, it dissolves and it evaporates into much more discrete issues and places. So I think always already you're putting the term really in scare quotes. It's difficult. I might say a couple of things about how you might deal with that, or I try and deal with it towards the end. So try and do some little sort of close readings, I guess. Might just kind of drop in and out because without much, we actually haven't had much time. I'd just like to sort of pull on some things. I'm not using PowerPoint, I'm just chat. So where might we start, and how might we challenge the assumptions about this idea about the Renaissance, and how might we teach it differently? One place I always start is visual culture, which I suppose is a posh way of talking about art. So looking at visual materials, I guess, before you start getting into the nitty-gritty of, as we were saying just before we started, the difficulty of text that you draw on. If you're drawing on Italian stuff, what are you doing? Petrarch? I mean, it's not easy. Even with the Tudor stuff, that's difficult as well. And then you collapse back into Shakespeare, and that's hopeless. So one way in which I start is with a painting like Hans Holbein's The Ambassadors. Very famous picture from 1533. It's in the National Gallery. It's on sort of half the books that are ever about the Renaissance. I write about it obsessively and persistently. So one way I think of starting is to look at that, because it's a very iconic image. People think of it as a quintessentially Renaissance image, and that's quite useful, because you can look at it and you can rehearse some of those classical traditional arguments about the Renaissance through it, but then I think also flip it. So you look at the painting, if you're familiar with it, you just look it up quickly. Those who haven't seen it, from Mars. What do you see? You see, again, it's classic, two wealthy elite men, two French diplomats, Jean de Dompville and Georges de Selve, who were in London in 1533. And they're surrounded by the trappings, you know, of wealth, humanist learning, of books, all the objects on the table that they're leaning on, sort of sense that this is a kind of elite world of, you know, conspicuous consumption. There's musical instruments, there's terrestrial globes, there's scientific objects. But when you start to drill down into it, and I often do this with students, look at it and say, look, there's an Ottoman rug there. So you immediately suddenly start to see the trace of perhaps a more global dimension. Look, you see smeared across the bottom of the painting an anamorphic skull. In the midst of all this, these images of sort of civilized aspiration, you have an anamorphic death head skull. Death is always present. Death will in the end get you. Then when we know a little bit more about what drove the painting was actually commissioned and painted by Holbein to celebrate what was hoped and ended up being a failed alliance between Tudor England, Henry VIII, France, and there are the two diplomats doing the deal, and the Ottoman Empire against the Spanish. So this was an Anglo-French Ottoman Islamic alliance against Catholic Spain. The deal didn't come off, and I think that's one of the reasons the painting seems so enigmatic, because it was then lost. It was actually only rediscovered in the 19th century and was given the title of the ambassadors because nobody else knew what to say about it. So it's interesting because it commemorates what was to be an alliance which failed, but that itself bespeaks a sort of more global picture. If you look at the terrestrial globe on the shelf, it actually shows the Treaty of Tordesillas, the line that was drawn in 1494 down the middle of the globe to suggest that everything to the west in the New World of the Americas was Spain, and everything to the east, everything, Africa, Southeast Asia, was Portuguese, this kind of mad European fancy. Nobody mentioned it to the Ottomans, the Chinese, and the Persians. So this is a Renaissance fantasy. The world could just be literally divided down the middle by Spanish and Portuguese powers. So there's a global dimension to it, and there's also a fractured global dimension to it, because if you look at the lute on the bottom shelf, it's next to a Lutheran hymn book, and one of the strings on the lute is broken. So it's this image of the fracturing that's just starting to happen in the 1530s with the impact of Lutheran thinking and Reformed religion. So you just start to see in that more traditional image something else start to emerge. Now, for me, I think it's very much about a kind of global world of Europe as we understand it at that time, encountering the world east of, say, Venice. My notion of talking about the Renaissance is that we always have to shift it a few hundred miles east. It's not necessarily about Florence or Naples or Rome. It's about Venice. It's about Constantinople. It's about Baghdad. That, for me, is where we need to sort of think about it, because those powers, predominantly Islamic and to some extent Arabic, are seen by these European powers at the time as far wealthier, more sophisticated and powerful, because most of the states that we're talking about here are small Christian principalities in Italy, France and Spain. They're much smaller than when you look at Persia, China or the Ottoman Empire. What I've always been interested in is that what you start to see is a kind of global competitive exchange in this period. That, I think, is for me what's driving a certain idea of the Renaissance. Not some absolute division between civilized Christians and others. That very notion is a late 19th century imperial Orientalist fantasy. And it's one that we're still, I'm afraid, trading with to some extent, but this period does not adhere to that kind of model. So you can see that, and as I glide quickly over all of 15th and 16th century high Italian art and architecture. But if you look at, say, early pictures by Giotto Giotto has Arabic inscriptions on his character's dress. The architecture of Venice isn't, as we all think, thanks to Ruskin, quintessentially Renaissance. But the architectural historian Deborah Howard wrote this great book called Venice in the East, said it's based on hundreds of years of amicable trade and exchange with the Islamic, Arabic, and Byzantine worlds. So much so that she says that really the architecture of Venice, she has a great phrase, she calls it one colossal souk. It's like a bazaar. And actually, if you look again at much of that architecture, and again, we've been sort of slightly, maybe brainwashed is too strong, but it's actually Oriental, but it's hidden in plain view, but we've just had that washed out for sort of the last 200 years by people like Burckhardt, Ruskin, Pater, and so on. What we now know, and people will talk about this from art history, is that most of the raw materials that are used in the arts and the clothing that we see and call Renaissance in paintings, Henry VIII, most of his outfits, you look more closely, they're sort of last season's Ottoman designs. But again, we've sort of go, it's Holbein, it's Henry VIII, it's quintessentially European, it's Christian. It's not. It's absolutely not. And it's hidden there in plain view because of this longer term competitive exchange, bringing in materials from across the Silk Road route, going through Istanbul, making alliances between Christians, Muslims, and Jews, often intermediaries in many of these deals. And that often trumps religious belief. We sort of talk about this idea of a confident Christianity, you know, pushing back against other cultures and other beliefs. It's just not true. If anything, what's driving that European Renaissance moment is the continent's relative poverty. Europe is on the edge of everything. It's not the center of the world, it's on the edge. It's trying to reach out. It has limited raw materials and limited goods. Nobody in the Ottoman Empire wants English wool, but we, as it were, in Europe, all wanted those exotic goodies that were flowing right across the land-based routes from China through Southeast Asia, back in through the Ottoman territories. So it's actually an attempt at sort of imperial emulation, I think, which drives what the Europeans are doing. We also often speak about it alongside that other very complicated term, which is worth airing now, humanism. We talk about the Renaissance and humanism, and Renaissance humanism often in the very same phrase. So Renaissance from Macmillan, from Burckhardt, defined as the rebirth, the Renaissance of Greco-Roman classical learning. Absolutely no, that it's purely Greco-Roman. Again, not the case, because we now know the rediscovery of many of those Latin and subsequently Greek texts, yes, came through Byzantium, but they also came through Constantinople. After the collapse of the classical world, most of that learning, Aristotle, Plato, etc., went east through Arabic learning into centers like Baghdad and Damascus, then back through the Byzantine Empire, where it had been saved, translated, cleaned up, as it were. And the Christian Europeans were very aware of that. And much of that is driven by trade. Again, we forget that what's driving a lot of these issues about Renaissance, whatever that means, is very much not about disinterested knowledge of a bunch of European scholars scouring libraries looking for books, but very much driven by an encounter of trade and transactions across the Mediterranean in the Middle East. Some of you will know Arabic trade and mathematics gave Europe algebra and, of course, Arabic numerals, easier to reckon profit and loss with than Roman numerals. And that's very much from an encounter, the kind of Venetian, Genoese encounter with Arabic and Islamic trading communities in the Middle East and across North Africa. So the stuff that I've written about is being, I guess, what we call cultural and artistic exchange between what we might very broadly call the West, Europe, and the East, particularly the Muslim territories of the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And what I've been writing about for years is that, as I've been saying, much of what we see as classical Renaissance comes about as a result of those exchanges. And it's where the European states and their rulers acknowledge their relative inferiority to the power of empires to the East. Now, there's an important qualifier here, because in terms of doing this, and I do like, I go and I talk, give a lot of talks to the Muslim community, I speak at mosques, This is a complicated one because this does not mean that we sort of just invert that model and we celebrate, as it were, Islamic and Arabic imperial power in this period. I think that it's still as oppressive and it's still as despotic as the European states. So it's not about turning from celebrating the West and then celebrating the East. It's about the exchange and the encounter that happens there. So and that's obviously politically at the moment, that's quite a tense issue because I think, get seen as a sort of apologist for classical Islamic power and authority, which is really not what I think this work is about. But certainly it's about this notion of exchange. As soon as Constantinople falls in 1453, the Venice state's first reaction is to agree a new commercial treaty with the Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror. They send painters like Bellini to work for him. They send architects who are part of the building of the Topkapi Sarai. Nearly every Italian city-state had close commercial, artistic, and diplomatic ties to the Ottomans in this period. And as we saw with the ambassadors, by the early 16th century, the French and Francois Premier, Francis I, had also made a very close and abiding alliance with the Ottomans. And that's one thing that Elizabeth I picks up on. And that's something else I've written about. But as I say, it's kind of out of the purview. But the fact that there's then an Anglo-Islamic alliance driven by Elizabeth's understanding that she's excommunicated from the Catholic Church in 1570. So she says, well, I've now been labeled a heretic. The only other great power in the world I could perhaps break bread with is also defined as a heretic, is Islam, which is seen, of course, within Christian theology as a heresy, not a theology in its own right. So Protestantism and Islam are somehow conflated as heresies. So clever as ever, Elizabeth first turns around and says, right, well, I'll make an alliance with the Ottomans. That's another part of the story. So we can maybe pick that up in a bit. The global dimension, one that I write about because I do a lot of stuff about maps, is the so-called Great Age of Discovery. And that again is very much tethered to a notion of the Renaissance. Is the Renaissance driven by the Reformation? Is it driven by print? Is it driven actually by discovery? You could sort of bedrock your notion of defining the Renaissance in 1492, Columbus's first landfall in the Americas. Da Gama reaching India in 1497. Magellan, the first circumnavigation of the globe, which takes place between 1519 and 1522. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. Again, that's very much driven by Europe's physical geography. If you think about, on a global image, you think about the position of Europe trying to reach China and Southeast Asia, you've got a problem because you're dealing with overland trade routes with tax points that are increasing the cost of the goods coming back into Europe. So what do you need to do? Seaborne expansion, circumvent those overland routes by going west, as we famously know Columbus does, to get to the east. And that's also what drives Magellan's voyage. That voyage is not ostensibly a circumnavigation. Magellan never meant to circumnavigate the globe. He meant to go to the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, in the Indian Ocean, round Cape Horn, and then come back. He just sort of misunderstood the size of the Pacific. And when he died in 1521, they all said, we're not going back that way. Let's go back via the Cape. So the first circumnavigation in 1522 by Magellan's surviving crew was an absolute mistake. But you can see, if you look again at the outcomes of those kind of encounters and seaborne voyages, Portuguese architecture around this period is completely defined by and shaped by African and Indian styles and motifs. It's called Manueline after the ruler at the time, King Manuel. That period was a moment of the encounter with West Africa and with India, and it defined the way in which Portuguese architecture and painting to some extent developed. So talking a little bit about Magellan, so for me, the first global circumnavigation completed in 1522, even though it's an accident, is really a point from which Europe imagines a global world. And I think for me, people often go on about, when do you date globalization? I would say this is, if not the moment, it's such a crucial moment when the world goes global, where Magellan's gone west to get to the east, but realized that you can do a whole global circuit. It's very interesting. Again, doing the stuff I do about maps, I suddenly discovered that terrestrial globes suddenly take off, surprise, surprise, from the mid-1520s. So that just the physical image of the terrestrial globe. The first surviving terrestrial globe is dated 1492. There's no terrestrial globes before that. From the 1520s, they're like Ford cars. Everybody's got terrestrial globes. And again, it creates that image, which I think for me is an early moment of globalization. So, if we're talking about the global Renaissance, then there we have it in a way. But also going back, thinking about where that leaves you, thinking about a lot of these terms, I talked a little bit about humanism already. Where does humanism leave us? Well, not as progressive a term as I think that very misunderstood word might suggest. We immediately lock onto it. It seems to somehow be free of religious intolerance. But one of the great problems about many of these humanist texts from this period is that they're actually reinforcing as much subordination as they're challenging. So, Alberti, Leon Battista Alberti, great humanist scholar, writes about architecture. One of his most influential texts is called On the Family, which is dated 1444. And On the Family, drawing on Greco-Roman models, absolutely reinforces the notion of a woman's economic place in the home. And many feminist historians from the 70s have made this argument. Jean Kelly Gadol famously said, did women have a renaissance? And her argument was no. Actually, probably in the late 13th and 14th century, you have more latitude than you did with the impact of humanist scholarship like Alberti's work on what that did for gendered relations. Not only that, but I used to work a lot with, my great mentor was Lisa Jardine, Marxist feminist historian who taught me very much, and I see this in the material, that actually the humanists were pretty unscrupulous. We buy back into a sort of romance about people like Montaigne, Erasmus, Machiavelli, but actually they're kind of guns for hire. They're using their learning, but they're very much using it in the service, particularly in the Italian peninsula, for local rulers who are effectively condottieri, they're mercenaries, who rule those small city-states. Aren't they beautiful or wonderful? You go to Ferrara, Mantova, even places like Milan, Urbino. They're great, but they've mainly appeared out of quite oppressive political regimes that have crushed republican communes. And of course, the notion of republicanism is a fiction which is kept alive in states like Florence and Venice, which again is still really, they're both really led by a small male elite. The Doge in his council in Venice, the Medici in Florence, but nobody believes that this is seriously representative of the people. So even the notion of republicanism is complicated, but humanists are certainly very much acting as advisors to these petty tyrants. They are intellectual guns for hire. We know this with people like Machiavelli and Erasmus. They notoriously change the dedication of their books according to who was in power. So Machiavelli's The Prince, was dedicated to the new Medici ruler, even after Machiavelli had been at the heart of the Republican regime. And when it was overthrown, he was actually tortured. But he was still using his learning to make a bid to be in a position of political power. So I think it's really important to sort of remember that we shouldn't romanticize the way in which humanism works. The other, of course, famous example, and it's an interesting one as a teaching, because you can teach More's Utopia, because it's written in Latin, but we have English translations. So it's quite a good one, I think, because you're not dealing, as it were, with archaic Tudor English with students, that it is originally in Latin. Very famous, of course, because you tend, when teaching it, to focus exclusively on book 2, on the representation of utopia as an ideal commonwealth. Is it a good idea? Is it bad? Is it desirable? Is it even viable? Again, when I teach it, I make the point that this gets things wrong. And this is the point. There are 2 books in More's Utopia. The first is all about his fictional character, Self More, meeting this traveler, another global dimension. The character who he meets is called Hythloday. And Hythloday is a fictional member of Vespucci's voyages to America in the late 15th and very early 16th century. And the book one actually describes it and says that utopia is somewhere in the Indian Ocean. Now, that's just a kind of jumping off point to talk about utopia. But the point is, it's a rhetorical game. More is not trying to make an argument for utopia as we understand it. He calls it the idea of an ideal commonwealth. And at the end, he says, well, you know, he says at the end, I don't think this will ever really happen, but there are some bits I'd really quite like to see happen and be put in place. This is a nonsense. What he's really doing, it's a way of endorsing any form of political ideology. It could be monarchy, it could be republicanism. Humanists were famously trained to argue both sides of an argument, regardless of any specific ethical beliefs. So there's no riddle to decipher in More's utopia, even though people have written about it for centuries. That's because it is deliberately ambiguous. It's designed to show his political paymaster, whoever it might be, Henry VIII or somebody else, that what somebody like More can do is use the classical humanist learning in adapting his counsel to suit whatever political belief is required. And don't forget, some of you noticed that the apparently wise and intolerant Sir Thomas More was also responsible for very enthusiastically pursuing, persecuting, and actually sending to their deaths religious heretics, Protestants. So, you know, again, this notion of humanism as a sort of idealized version of what changes and shifts and is so quintessentially Renaissance to some extent, yes, I think we need to be really, really careful about how we use it when we're teaching those texts. They're deliberately slippery, really deliberately. And that's really why I think More's utopia and the concept that he develops has been appropriated, as we know, by almost every political modern belief system, from communism to fascism. And that's no accident, because it's a deliberately ambiguous open text, which was about More keeping his eye to the main chance, not producing some enlightened model of scholarship. So I'm going to sort of just make some concluding comments, because then it'd be really nice to sort of chat and open it up and tell me I'm wrong, or just dive into certain bits of it. It becomes really difficult, I think, still talking about the Renaissance. One key problem you have, even if you're holding on to the term, is it a historical period, circa 1400 to 1600, or is it an ethos? Is it an idea? Is it a spirit? Is it something not chronological but intangible, which is really, I think, what Walter Pater was trying to get at. You know, we now talk about many Renaissances. We talk about the Harlem Renaissance. We talk about the African Renaissance. So is there just a specific spirit that we need to talk about, and perhaps lose the chronological argument about Renaissance? Because as soon as we start to pin it down, as I said earlier, across the different disciplines, if you're a historian, art historian, literary critic, you know, geographer, etc., all those different disciplines have different chronological notions of what the Renaissance is. I'm certainly, I think, increasingly unhappy with it as a chronological period. I think that makes things harder than easier. It's certainly much more of a global dimension than we've been led to believe. Something that just sort of seems to start in Florence in 1400. Burckhardt has this great argument. He says, you know, around 1400, Italy suddenly swarmed with individuality. These great images of people waking up going, God, I'm an individual, go out and have a coffee. And you can imagine what my poor medievalist colleagues feel of this. They say, oh, right, really? So Chaucer wasn't an individual? I mean, come on. One of the ways in which I guess I try and deal with that is to use the term not Renaissance, but early modern. So historians for some decades have been using this to talk about the early modern period, which is therefore more chronological and descriptive. But as the phrase suggests, whereas Renaissance is backward looking and about rebirth, early modern uses a term which suggests what we start to glimpse are emerging ideas of modern, as in modernity, modern ideas about identity, about the self, about gender, those kind of issues that we see vaguely beginning to emerge, some for good, some for bad. So if we were to stay canonical, we could say that a play like Hamlet is showing us something like the development of modern subjectivity. A character like Hamlet is inward, he's existential, he's struggling with various beliefs. He looks to some extent modern. But even when you do that, I think that comes at a cost, because as I point out to my students who all the guys go, yes, Hamlet, and all the women go, yeah, and Ophelia. All the women in the play are destroyed in the service of this version of early modern male subjectivity. It's what happens in a play like Othello. There's been such a move to embrace Othello as a somehow multicultural play because of all the issues about questions of race and ethnicity. But I now teach it and say, and look what happens to the women in the play. So in this early modern emergence of ideas about self, of race, of ethnicity, also what happens is you've basically got a murderous husband who kills his wife, who's done nothing wrong. So I don't want to end on a downer, but as I say, I think that that's maybe a way in which we can also, I guess, think about using the Renaissance and this term, the early modern, as a history of the present. You can all hear, and we're not going too deep, I guess, into questions of decolonizing the curriculum, but that's certainly something that I think is possible to do by complicating what we look at when we look at this period slash spirit called the Renaissance, that isn't the Renaissance anymore, but is now called early modern. And I will stop because it then gives us 20 minutes to chat.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that, Jerry. I feel like you definitely threw in some sort of controversial arguments, but also some different takes of how I hadn't actually thought of it for quite a while. Harriet, did you have any questions at all? But now it's our time to sort of open it up to everybody else. Do you have any questions? Jerry mentioned quite a lot about how you could sort of approach teaching this. Does anybody want to go or ask about that any further? You can just pop those in the chat now.
As people are pondering it, oh, sorry, I was just responding to the chat, really. The Black Death thing is really interesting. Jason was asking about that. I mean, I think that's right. So the way in which that sort of catastrophe of the Black Death is interesting, isn't it? Because, of course, coming out of a pandemic, I think it's interesting to sort of connect students with that, to make the point that out of that absolute sort of devastation, the Holocaust, the Black Death, you're right, then leads to a complete change in understanding of social and cultural and artistic process. You literally, you're starting again. So the notion that catastrophe is also an opportunity, I guess. And so, yeah, people have written about that it's another way in which you could think about some rebirth or something that changes being driven by that absolute ecological, health-driven catastrophe. And inventions followed it by what makes a Renaissance monarch. Yeah, and again, because of the difficulty of working across communes, that you have to, the belief in the strong man, the Renaissance man. It's the real problem, you see, I think, with Burckhardt's thing. We all go on about Burckhardt. Burckhardt's thing is, the Renaissance is born out of tyranny and scholars who go with that and work with it. That is the reality of what that very late 14th, early 15th century humanistica, the development of the educational curriculum, which is humanist, that's what it's doing. It's in the service of those despotic tyrants. So, this is sort of difficult stuff. We're not talking about precisely Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment, of course, is a much later moment. So we tend to run them together or flip the Enlightened idea back into the Renaissance. I think that's wrong. And yes, somebody just saying the English perspective and a little bit of Italy. And it's really problematic. Henry VIII buys in humanist scholars. He brings in Erasmus because he wants help with his divorce. Those are the kind of realities of how the patronage works. It's not that, again, that word, he's not necessarily some great enlightened patron of the arts. It's very much in the service of something else. What then comes of that? Yeah, interesting. You can't control necessarily what happens if you have people like Erasmus and more doing what they're doing. And yes, it does lead to more innovative stuff. But that is the reality of how the patronage works.
Right. I don't know if anybody else has got any questions, but I sort of wanted to ask a little bit more about there were two things really. One is I really sort of liked the statement of how you said about that you think that we should move the Renaissance 300 miles east, and focus on sort of Constantinople, and I think you mentioned Baghdad in that sentence as well. If I wanted to sort of approach it from to talk about it in those places, where are some sort of good main places to start, I suppose, to look to investigate that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of work is now being done on, I guess, the later Tudor period, on the relationship with the Turks, with the Ottomans. So a guy called Matthew Dimmock, who was a graduate student of mine. He's actually really old. He's now a professor at Sussex. Terribly old. He wrote a book called New Turks, which looked at all the diplomatic commercial exchanges throughout the 16th into the early 17th century. So specifically from an English perspective. I mean, I guess Renaissance Bazaar, the book I wrote in the VSI, was deliberately written. In the wake, I guess it's touching on what you're saying. I was writing those books just before 9/11. And I remember going to Italy just after 9/11. And of course, Italy was empty. There was nobody there. And I was walking around thinking, we have a notion of civilization, which is very much bedrocked on what I'm seeing. I'm walking around the Italian Renaissance, and it's about civilization. And at that very moment, you were hearing the argument about a clash of civilizations, the war on terror, the East as, backward. And I thought, blimey, this is why we do this stuff, to challenge that rhetorical argument. Because actually, you move to Constantinople, you look at Mehmet the Conqueror from 1453 to 1480, he creates the great imperial city. He's building palaces, he's employing Western artists, he's translating Greco-Roman classical texts. All the Venetians and the Florentines are going, do you know what? Leonardo and Michelangelo are both invited out to work for the Ottoman sultans. And, it only just doesn't come off because, you're invited by every patron. But that's the reality. The biggest patron at that time was not Francis I, it was not the Medici, it was the Ottoman Empire, emperors, the Ottoman sultans, because they had the greatest wealth. And it's a very, YBA argument. If you're Damien Hirst, you want to go to the biggest patrons because they give you the most money and you can then do the biggest things. It's as simple as that. So for me, it's about the fact that, yes, the gaze is always much further east. Florence is always looking to Byzantium and then Constantinople / Istanbul. That's bedrocked on the way in which those Arabic societies have built centers of translation. Baghdad much earlier, in the 14th century, as centers of intellectual translation, of science, particularly the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. So all these things, and of course historians of science from that period know this, but it just doesn't then get matched up with a story about the Renaissance. And I think gradually it is starting to happen. So that work is there. It's absolutely there. But obviously, it's what we were talking about. It's often so recondite. It's so scholarly. My thing is, we were taught, I don't have much Greek and my Latin's pretty crap, but if you do the Renaissance for 200 years, you've been told that you have to learn Greek and Latin, and then you have some European vernacular languages. Nobody ever said you need Arabic, you need Turkish. That is the reality now. If you want to understand what's going on in the 15th century, you cannot just stay locked in that Greco-Roman Latinate tradition. You have to understand what's going on further east, because you're just missing one side of the equation. I think it was awful, the bombing of Baghdad, the first Gulf War, I used to stand up and give talks and say, okay, we're just saying that, Baghdad's being bombed. I said, if you imagine that, China suddenly started bombing Florence, that's the equivalent because of what's being lost there culturally and artistically and in the archives. But nobody thinks about that because of the sort of nasty Orientalism that sadly we have come to accept in the West. So it's like, it's just Baghdad. No, actually it's not. It's kind of one of them, the loss of Damascus and Aleppo, in the Syrian civil war is just, for us in this period, just a devastation. It's just, again, it would be like losing one of those great Italian city-states. Everybody goes, it's just, it's the Middle East, doesn't matter. That is where the center of gravity for me, with so many of the exchanges were about. And it's just hidden in plain view. It's Deborah Howard's argument about architecture. We've just been brainwashed into the 19th century.
Right.
I had a question actually. So we have got the Renaissance in our Key Stage 3 curriculum, but unfortunately due to timetabling, I'm not actually teaching it. So I'm just relying on feedback from other teachers.
Yeah.
One of the questions that I had, which was if you had to include certain individuals within like a Renaissance unit, which individuals would you be tempted to include? Because there's a whole range of people that you could, and obviously we haven't got time to teach all of them. So who would you have as your go-to people?
Do you need it as English or do you need it as European?
European, preferably, in my opinion. I think that's a lot of stronger weighting from what we have planned anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I guess what I always do is, because still I work with canonical stuff. My thing is, it's the old Audre Lorde argument, isn't it, about how do you dismantle the master's house? Do you do it from inside or outside? So I'd still go canonical, because that's my old left-wing training, that if you're going to have an argument about high culture, do it with Shakespeare, because people will listen. So I'd still say you'd start with Mehmet the Conqueror. You would absolutely say that Mehmet is a European ruler, who controls half of Eastern Europe, even, or Suleiman the Magnificent. So you start with Suleiman the Magnificent and you say, look, this is a guy who owns half the world and is in Vienna in 1529. And that's why Eastern Europe is what it's like. That's why Belgrade and Budapest are as they are, because of the influence of that high tide of Ottoman imperialism. And that Suleiman is working with Henry VIII, with Francis I, with Charles V. So I guess you'd move from those iconic figures, like those figures, because they're all Henry VIII, yeah. But I do maybe a Portuguese ruler, somebody like King John III. Beyond that, you then want to, I guess, look at different scholars and writers. I think you then want to. I'm trying to do this at the moment. I'm trying to do a 10-part series on radio for Radio 3 to sort of say, stop doing just the elite. What is this notion of ordinary people? Everybody is extraordinary, so it's a nonsense. So I think that what I guess you try and do is then change the terms and look at other writers, look at, Mary Roth, for instance, maybe go that late, go to somebody who were now recovering, women writers who have just been neglected. We all talk about Sir Philip Sidney. Well, what about Mary Sidney? She was translating the Psalms, doing this amazing stuff. So I'd go from the high iconic, the male, but then sort of mix it up, because I think you can do that with gender and with race. I'm happy to, it'd be interesting. I mean, I'm very happy, I'm doing it off the cuff, but to talk further with you and brainstorm that, actually. Because I think you have to now, I think now with multicultural, diverse classrooms, you just can't do bloody Henry VIII anymore. I've been saying this for 20 years. The Renaissance in the Tudor period, even then, was not just about pale, white-faced, red-haired people. Miranda Kaufman's written this book. I have issues with it, but I support it, called Black Tudors. So it's just a complete revelation. We've known this in the archives, and she goes back to Henry VIII's black musicians, right through to black sex workers working in the early 1600s. And she's recovered the lives from the archives of various figures, she's calling Black Tudors. My thing is that my only concern with that is it produces a slightly anachronistic race reading. And I've always wanted to say to Miranda, it's great, but they're all Muslims as well. So bear that in mind. So it's this difficult game that you're playing and again, it's often as we try and connect these things together, I'm sort of saying, we're saying the same thing, but you're racializing it, which is important. And I'm saying it's also about religion and the fact that those figures, blackamoors, are mainly Muslim. And of course, you're seeing them as black because they are racialized. That's great. But her work is really good. Catherine Fletcher's just written, is it Dark Side of the Renaissance? Just a new book about the Renaissance. So there's a lot of that qualification, I think, going on and unpicking, which isn't, all the kind of right-wing press response hysteria of decolonizing the curriculum and I don't think that's it. We're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're actually just producing more complexity. So when I did the book on Orient Isle, my grand, I shouldn't say it, elderly male white editor said, I don't buy this. He said it's some post-colonial nonsense. And at the end of it, he said, I now accept that every single elite Tudor white man that I've been taught about at Oxford has some connection to Anglo-Islamic relations. Yeah, Henry VIII, Leicester, Essex, Burghley, Walsingham, they're all absolutely embedded in exchanges with the Islamic world. You know, they're converting. You know, nobody knows. You know, talked about this in the 1570s. You've got Englishmen openly and willingly converting to Islam in the 1570s because they think at that point, being part of the Islamic Empire, when England's just about to be destroyed by the Spanish Armada, is probably a really good bet. And again, it's just rethinking that whole moment. We're looking at this idea of the Renaissance down the wrong end of the telescope. So I think with the figures and the themes that you're using at Key Stage 3, you can do something really exciting and interesting. You can move from the iconic and the well-known to the less well-known and the more challenging. It's really interesting.
Thank you. There's lots to ponder over there. I don't think we've got any more questions in the chat, have we, Sian?
No, I think we should just bring it to an end there. I really love that quote that we are looking at the Renaissance from the wrong end of the telescope. I'm gonna take it, and that's gonna go probably into my lesson. But I would just like to thank everybody for attending tonight. Sorry about technical issues to start with, but I think I can speak for everyone when I said that it has been just as good regardless of that. So just to let everybody know that our next talk that is coming up is in October, and it's about with Gemma Holman, and she is going to look into royal witches and researching women in the 15th century. So I'm just going to pop the link for that in the chat if you want to sign up for that now. We'll also post it on all of our Twitter, etc. But thank you all for joining us. Please feel free to leave and enjoy your evenings even further now.